The year was 1942, and the air inside the offices of the Manhattan Engineer District on the fifth floor of the new War Department building in Washington smelled of burnt coffee, stale cigarettes, and the quiet sweat of men carrying a secret that could not be spoken aloud. The building was new. The corridors were still raw with the smell of drying plaster and fresh linoleum. Beyond the windows, the Potomac moved slowly through a capital city that was bracing itself for the possibility that the war might be lost. In Europe, the Wehrmacht had swallowed the continent whole. The Wehrmacht controlled everything from the fjords of Norway to the deserts of North Africa. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate that threatened to sever the supply lines between America and Britain. In the Pacific, Japan had consumed an empire of islands and coastlines that stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The news was bad, and it had been bad for months. But inside that building, behind a locked door with no nameplate, a different kind of war was being fought. It was a war of physics, of engineering, of industrial logistics so vast that its architects could barely comprehend their own blueprints. The men inside that room knew something that almost no one else on Earth understood. They knew that the atom could be split. They knew that if you could gather enough of a specific kind of uranium, a rare, lighter isotope called uranium-235, and slam two pieces of it together at the right speed, you could release energy equivalent to thousands of tons of explosives. You could build a weapon that would make every other weapon in the history of warfare look like a sharpened stick. And they knew, or feared, that somewhere in the Black Forest or the laboratories of Leipzig, German physicists were trying to do the same thing first. The problem was not theory. The theory was settled. The problem was material. The problem was that uranium-235 barely existed. Natural uranium is a liar. It looks like one substance, but it is two. Over 99% of it is uranium-238, a heavy, stable isotope that sits in the ground doing nothing useful for a weapon. Less than 1%, 0.7% to be precise, is uranium-235, the lighter, volatile sibling that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. The two isotopes are chemically identical. They react the same way with acids, with solvents, with everything a chemist might use to separate them. They differ only in mass, and that difference is barely more than 1%. In the spring of 1942, the entire nation's supply of isolated uranium-235 could be measured in milligrams, not pounds, not ounces, not grams, milligrams. Invisible dust on a laboratory slide. And the bomb required 64 kilograms, 141 pounds. The gap between what existed and what was needed was not a gap, it was a canyon. It was the distance between a match head and a forest fire. Several methods of separating the two isotopes were being explored. Gaseous diffusion, thermal diffusion, centrifuge, but one stood out for its brute, elegant simplicity: electromagnetic separation. The idea had been born in the mind of a physicist named Ernest Orlando Lawrence at the University of California, Berkeley. Lawrence was a South Dakotan, the son of a superintendent of schools, a man who radiated an almost manic energy, who spoke fast, worked fast, and built machines faster than anyone thought possible. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1939 for inventing the cyclotron, a device that whipped charged particles in circles using massive electromagnets. He was the kind of man who did not wait for permission. He was the kind of man who started building before the blueprints were dry and apologized for the budget overruns later. Lawrence understood that if you could ionize uranium atoms, strip them of electrons, giving them an electrical charge, and send them flying through a powerful magnetic field, the lighter U-235 atoms would curve in a slightly tighter arc than the heavier U-238 atoms. At the end of their semicircular journey, the two streams would land a fraction of an inch apart. Place a collector at each landing point, and you could harvest the isotopes separately. It was like sorting coins by rolling them down a curved ramp. The lighter ones curve tighter, the heavier ones swing wider. He called his device a calutron, a name stitched together from California University's cyclotron. The first one was built by dismantling the old 37-inch cyclotron in his Berkeley laboratory. It fired up on December 2, 1941, 5 days before Pearl Harbor. The beam intensity was feeble, a few microamperes, producing microscopic quantities of enriched uranium, but it worked. And in a war where the enemy might be months ahead of you, a working method, no matter how slow, was worth more than a perfect method that existed only on a chalkboard. The decision was made to scale this laboratory curiosity into an industrial colossus, to take a machine that sat on a laboratory bench and build a version of it the size of a football stadium, to do it in months, not years, to do it in secret. The electromagnetic separation process required magnets, enormous magnets, not the small horseshoe magnets from a child's toy box, but electromagnets of staggering size and power, coils of conductive wire wrapped around steel cores, carrying enough electrical current to generate magnetic fields powerful enough to bend the trajectory of individual atoms. The conductor of choice for any electrical engineer in 1942 was copper. Copper was the blood of the electrical world. It was soft, it was ductile, it conducted electricity with minimal resistance, and it could be drawn into wire of any gauge. The calutrons being designed for the industrial plant, designated U-12 to be built on a stretch of Tennessee Ridge line called Oak Ridge, would require approximately 5,000 tons of copper for their magnet windings. The number landed on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth D. Nichols like a grenade with the pin pulled. Nichols was 34 years old. He had graduated 5th in his class at West Point in 1929, earned a Ph.D. in engineering, and was now the Deputy District Engineer of the Manhattan Engineer District. He was a precise man, methodical, with clear blue eyes and a mind that operated like a micrometer. He solved problems with arithmetic, not speeches, and the arithmetic of the copper problem was catastrophic. In 1942, copper was the most critically short strategic material in the American war effort. Every artillery shell casing consumed copper, every bullet jacket, every foot of field telephone wire, every radio, every motor and generator in every ship, tank, and aircraft consumed copper. The War Production Board had classified it as a critical strategic material. The military was consuming it faster than the mines could produce it. Asking for 5,000 additional tons for a project so secret that its purpose could not be revealed to anyone outside a handful of cleared officials was not merely difficult, it was impossible. The copper simply did not exist. And then someone had an idea that sounded absurd until you thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. Silver. Pure silver was an excellent electrical conductor. Not quite as good as copper, but remarkably close. The substitution ratio was approximately 11 to 10. For every 11 pounds of copper you would have needed, you could use 10 pounds of silver instead. Silver did not corrode the way copper sometimes did. It could be drawn and rolled and wound just like copper. The physics worked perfectly. The problem was where to get 10,000 tons of silver in the middle of a world war. There was one place, only one place on the continent where that quantity of silver existed in a single location, inventoried, refined, stacked in bars, and waiting. The West Point Bullion Depository in New York State. Built in 1937 on the grounds of the United States Military Academy, it was a concrete and steel fortress nestled among the oldest buildings of the American military establishment. Inside its vaults sat the strategic silver reserve of the United States of America, hundreds of millions of troy ounces of bullion, each bar weighing roughly 31 kilograms, each bar stamped and numbered and accounted for to the hundredth of an ounce. This silver was not scrap. It was not surplus. It was the monetary backing of the American economy. It belonged to the people of the United States, held in trust by the Treasury Department, and every ounce of it was sacred to the bankers and bureaucrats who guarded it. On August 3, 1942, Kenneth Nichols walked into the office of Daniel W. Bell, the Undersecretary of the Treasury, and asked to borrow it. The conversation that followed has become one of the great bureaucratic comedies in the history of the American government. Bell listened to the request. He was a treasury man, a man of ledgers and decimal points, a man who had spent his career weighing the national wealth in units smaller than a human fingernail. He asked Nichols how much silver the army needed. 6,000 tons, Nichols said. Bell paused. He asked, with the careful precision of a man defending his institution, how many troy ounces that would be. Nichols did not know. He was an engineer. He thought in tons. In weight you could feel. In mass you could move with a truck and a crane. He had no idea how to convert tons to troy ounces. Neither did Bell. A silence settled over the office. Two of the most capable officials in the United States government, one representing the military arm of the most expensive secret project in history, and the other representing the financial reserves of the most powerful economy on Earth, sat across a desk from each other, unable to perform a unit conversion. Nichols, growing impatient, said he did not know how many troy ounces he needed, but he knew he needed 6,000 tons, and that was a definite quantity. What difference, he asked, did it make how they expressed it? Bell drew himself upright. His reply has echoed through the decades with the dry dignity of a man who understood that language is power. "Young man," he said, "you may think of silver in tons, but the Treasury will always think of silver in troy ounces." The answer, when someone finally did the arithmetic, was approximately 400 million troy ounces. At today's silver prices, that quantity would be worth roughly $16 billion. Even in 1942, it was an almost incomprehensible amount of precious metal, more silver than the entire nation's coinage consumed in 2 years. But Congress had already authorized the use of up to 86,000 tons of Treasury silver for defense purposes. The request was approved. On August 29, 1942, Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote formally to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau requesting the silver for what he described only as a highly secret matter. He gave no indication of its purpose. He stipulated that the silver must be of fineness 0.999, essentially pure, that legal title would remain with the United States government at all times, and that every single ounce would be returned within 5 years in its original quantity, form, and fineness. He was borrowing the treasure of a nation, and he was signing for it like a man checking out a library book he promised not to dog-ear. The logistics of what followed were a masterwork of wartime secrecy and industrial choreography. The silver had to be moved, melted, reshaped, wound, shipped, installed, and accounted for, all without anyone outside the project knowing what the metal was, where it was going, or why. The first shipment left the West Point Bullion Depository in October 1942. Over 400,000 bullion bars, each weighing approximately 1,000 fine troy ounces, were loaded onto trucks under armed guard. The bars were dense, heavy, cold rectangles of almost pure silver, each one stamped with an identification number, each one logged in a ledger that would be reconciled monthly for the next 28 years. The silver traveled first to a facility operated by the Defense Plant Corporation in Carteret, New Jersey. There, the bars were melted down in furnaces and recast as cylindrical billets, solid silver cylinders that could be fed into rolling mills. The refinery was so meticulous about recovering every particle of metal that they actually managed to increase the total weight slightly by sweeping up residual silver dust from cracks and crevices left behind by previous operations. They were recovering atoms that previous tenants had lost. From Carteret, the billets were transported across New Jersey to the Phelps Dodge copper plant in Bayway. Phelps Dodge was one of the great names in American metallurgy, a company that had been working copper since before the Civil War. Their engineers rolled the silver billets into long, flat strips. Each strip was 5/8 of an inch thick, 3 inches wide, and 40 feet long. Silver ribbons, bright as mirrors, cold to the touch, dense enough that a single strip weighed more than a man could comfortably lift. These strips were loaded onto rail cars under armed guard and sent west to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Their destination was the Allis-Chalmers manufacturing plant, specifically the Hawley Road facility in the suburb of West Allis. Allis-Chalmers was a heavy industrial giant, a company that built steam turbines, mining equipment, and agricultural machinery. During the war, they had pivoted to military production: turbo superchargers for bombers, steam turbines for destroyers, electrical equipment for submarines. Their Hawley Road plant had been built in just 70 days under a Navy contract. It employed over 35,000 workers, 78% of them women, filling the positions left empty by men at war. At Allis-Chalmers, the silver strips were wound with wooden insulation around giant steel spools, creating the magnet coils that would power the calutrons. Each finished coil weighed approximately 14 tons. 940 of them were produced. Each one contained on average about 14 tons of silver, 14 tons of the United States Treasury's monetary reserve, wrapped in wood, encased in steel, and destined for a facility in Tennessee that did not officially exist. The completed coils were sealed inside welded steel casings that served double duty. They protected the silver from damage during transport, and they concealed its nature from anyone who might see them. A welded steel box on a rail car could be anything. It could be engine parts, transformer cores, industrial scrap. No one looking at it would guess that it contained more precious metal than most banks held in their vaults. The coils traveled by rail from Milwaukee to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, arriving at a construction site that was, by late 1943, one of the largest in the world. Oak Ridge did not exist in 1942. It was not a city, it was not a town. It was a stretch of ridgeline and valley along the Clinch River, 20 miles west of Knoxville, Tennessee, home to approximately 3,000 people living in small farming communities with names that sounded like chapters in a folk tale: Wheat, Elza, Scarborough, Robertsville. The families who lived there had been on that land for generations. Some had been displaced twice before, once for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, once for the Norris Dam. Now the government was coming for them a third time. In September 1942, Brigadier General Leslie Groves approved the acquisition of 59,000 acres. The families received notices tacked to their doors. They were told to leave. The official reason given was that the land was needed for a demolition range. They were given weeks. Some received compensation that was insultingly low. The government's appraisers valued hard-scrabble Appalachian farmland at Depression-era prices. Some received almost nothing. They gathered what they could carry, loaded their trucks and wagons, and drove away from the land where they had been born, where their parents had been born, where their grandparents had cleared the trees and broken the soil. Behind them, bulldozers arrived. Roads were carved through forests. Concrete was poured. Buildings rose from the mud at a pace that defied comprehension. Within months, the population exploded from 3,000 to over 75,000. Oak Ridge became the fifth largest city in Tennessee, a city that appeared on no map, that was surrounded by fences and armed guards, that was accessible only through checkpoints where every person had to show a pass and state a purpose. The construction was the largest in the world at that time, larger than the Panama Canal. Materials poured in by the trainload, over 2,000 carloads of electrical equipment, over 5,000 carloads of lumber, over 1,000 carloads of steel pipe and fittings, and arriving in welded steel boxes on flat cars guarded by men who did not know what they were guarding, 940 silver-wound magnet coils containing 14,700 tons of the United States Treasury's silver. The Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant began to take shape. It was a complex of 9 massive buildings, each containing one of the alpha racetracks, enormous oval formations of calutrons, each racetrack 122 feet long, 77 feet wide, and 15 feet high, containing 96 individual calutron tanks. The beta racetracks, smaller and rectangular, contained 36 tanks each. In total, 1,152 calutrons were installed. The silver coils were bolted into place, connected to power supplies, and energized with enough electrical current to light a city. The magnetic fields they produced were terrifyingly powerful. Any ferrous metal brought near an active calutron would be violently seized and pinned against the machine. There is a documented incident where workers were transporting a steel plate and got too close to an energized magnet. The plate slammed against the calutron and pinned a worker against it like an insect pressed beneath a thumb. His colleagues ran to the supervisor and begged him to shut down the magnet to free the man. The supervisor refused. He said the war was killing 300 people an hour. If they shut down the magnet, it would take days to restabilize and resume production. That delay, measured in lost uranium output, would cost hundreds of lives. He told them to pry the man off with 2x4s. They did. The workers survived. But the incident tells you everything you need to know about the calculus of that place. At Oak Ridge, every hour was measured in the currency of human life. Signs were posted at every gate, on every fence, inside every building. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. The phrase was printed on billboards, on posters in the cafeterias, on placards in the dormitories. It was the civic motto of a city that did not officially exist. Workers who commuted from Knoxville by bus were sometimes asked by curious neighbors what they were doing out there. The standard reply, delivered with a deadpan that could only come from genuine ignorance, was as little as possible. The city was segregated. White workers lived in prefabricated houses and dormitories. Black workers were housed in hutments, plywood shacks with no internal plumbing, heated by coal stoves, crowded 5 to a unit. The hutments leaked in the rain and froze in the winter. The bathrooms were communal. The inequality was brutal, routine, and unremarked upon by the officials who designed the city. It was wartime America, and the urgency of building an atomic weapon did not extend to the urgency of building a just society. But inside the Y-12 plant, all of that was invisible. Inside, there was only the hum of the magnets, the glow of the vacuum tubes, the click and whir of machinery working at the atomic scale. Inside, the silver was doing its job. 14,700 tons of it, coiled and energized, bending the paths of uranium atoms one by one, sorting the light from the heavy, the weapon from the waste, the future from the past. The calutrons were operated not by the PhD physicists that Ernest Lawrence wanted, but by young women recruited from the farms and mill towns of eastern Tennessee. Lawrence had insisted that only trained scientists could run his machines. He had used PhD students at Berkeley. He believed the process was too delicate, too complex, too important for anyone without advanced degrees in physics. The labor shortage of wartime America did not care what Lawrence believed. The Tennessee Eastman Corporation, which managed the Y-12 plant, launched a recruiting campaign across the rural counties. The advertisements promised good wages and told the women they would be helping the boys overseas. Most of the recruits had just graduated from high school. Some came from textile mills where they had been earning a fraction of what Oak Ridge paid. Some came from farms where the only machinery they had ever operated was a hand-cranked butter churn. They were trained for 3 weeks. They were told nothing about what they were doing. They were told they were making a catalyst important to the war effort. They sat in cubicles, each woman controlling one calutron tank, adjusting dials, watching meters, keeping needles in the zones they had been shown. They wore fountain pen-sized dosimeters clipped to their collars, checking their radiation exposure at the end of each shift. They walked past billboards every day that said, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." They became known as the Calutron Girls. When Kenneth Nichols compared the production data between the Oak Ridge women and Lawrence's PhD physicists at Berkeley, the result shocked everyone. The young women from Tennessee were consistently outperforming the scientists. It was not close. Lawrence refused to believe it. He declared a formal competition between his Berkeley team and the Oak Ridge operators. The women won again. The explanation was simple and devastating. The scientists could not stop thinking. When a dial fluctuated, a physicist would stop the process to investigate why. He wanted to understand the underlying cause. He wanted to publish a paper about it. He wanted to optimize the theory. The women did not know the theory. They had been trained to keep the needles where they were supposed to be. When a dial drifted, they corrected it. When it drifted again, they corrected it again. They had the instinct of a mechanic who could tune a Model T engine by feel, by sound, by the vibration in her fingertips, without knowing a thing about thermodynamics or combustion chemistry. They made it sing, and the uranium flowed. Every month during the war, Kenneth Nichols signed an inventory statement for the United States Treasury, certifying that his project had in its possession over 400 million troy ounces of silver, expressed to the hundredths of an ounce. 400 million troy ounces, expressed to hundredths. This was not an approximation. It was a monthly audit so precise that it accounted for shavings on a floor in Tennessee that most Americans did not know existed. General Leslie Groves, the commanding officer of the Manhattan Project, a man his own subordinates described in language that would not survive a Sunday school, was obsessive about returning the silver. He understood that if the project lost even a fraction of the Treasury's metal, the political consequences would be catastrophic. The project was already spending $2 billion in wartime appropriations. If it also lost billions of dollars worth of borrowed silver, no amount of scientific achievement would save the men responsible from congressional fury. Groves ordered that every surface that came into contact with silver be scrubbed. Every filing, every shaving, every particle of dust swept from a floor or wiped from a workbench was collected, weighed, and logged. The workers who handled the silver strips at Alice Chalmers walked on graded floors with collection pans beneath. The refiners at Carteret accounted for their spillage to fractions of a gram. The entire supply chain from West Point to Carteret to Bayway to Milwaukee to Oak Ridge was monitored with a fanaticism that bordered on the religious. The silver was not being spent, it was being used, and the distinction was absolute. Every atom of it was expected to come home. Over 2 years, the calutrons at Y12 produced approximately 64 kilograms of enriched uranium, 141 pounds, the weight of a small man. That was the total output of a facility that covered 80 acres, employed 22,000 people, consumed more electricity than the city of New York, and used 14,700 tons of borrowed silver from the vaults of the United States Treasury. All of it was used. Every gram was packed into the weapon designated Little Boy, a gun-type fission bomb 10 feet long, 28 inches in diameter, weighing nearly 5 tons. The design was simple enough to explain in a sentence. A hollow cylinder of enriched uranium was fired down a gun barrel into a solid target cylinder of the same material. When the two pieces merged, they formed a supercritical mass. A chain reaction began. Of the 64 kilograms of uranium in the bomb, less than 1 kilogram actually underwent fission, and of that kilogram, only 6/10 of a gram, the weight of a butterfly, was converted into energy. That energy was equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. On August 6, 1945, at 17 seconds past 8:15 in the morning, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima from an altitude of 31,000 feet. It fell for 44 seconds. It detonated at a height of roughly 1,900 feet above the city. The fireball reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. The blast wave flattened 2/3 of the city. The estimated dead numbered 70,000 instantly and over 100,000 by the end of the year. The uranium that killed them had been separated by teenage girls from Tennessee who did not know what they were making, using machines powered by magnets wound from the silver that backed the American dollar, silver that had been sitting in a vault at West Point, guarded by cadets who would one day lead the army that dropped the bomb. The electrical energy run through those silver coils to separate the uranium was itself a staggering number. One physicist calculated that it was equivalent to about 1,400 kilotons of TNT, roughly 100 times the energy released by the bomb itself. The machine that made the weapon consumed more energy than the weapon produced. It was an industrial paradox that revealed a profound truth about the cost of atomic warfare. Nature does not surrender its secrets cheaply. You must spend a fortune and effort to unlock even a small, terrible dividend of destruction. The entire Y-12 plant consumed electricity at a rate that rivaled a major American city. The power came from the Tennessee Valley Authority's hydroelectric dams, the same dams that had displaced some of the same families who were displaced again when Oak Ridge was built. The irony was structural. The government had flooded their valleys in the 1930s to build dams. Then it used the electricity from those dams to power magnets wound from borrowed silver to separate uranium to build a bomb to end a war that the generation growing up in those valleys was fighting. Every link in the chain was forged from the same people, the same land, the same Tennessee clay. The total cost of the Manhattan Project was approximately $2.2 billion, about $45 billion in today's money. That number did not include the value of the borrowed silver because the silver was returned. It was a loan, not an expense. But if you counted it, if you added the 14,700 tons of silver to the bill, the Manhattan Project consumed more national treasure than any single military program in American history. And it produced, at the end of all that spending, all that construction, all that secrecy, all that displacement of families and disruption of lives, 64 kilograms of metal. Enough to fill a small suitcase. Enough to destroy a city. When the Calutron girls learned what they had built, when the news of Hiroshima reached Oak Ridge on August 6, 1945, the reactions were not simple. They were not the clean, cinematic emotions of triumph or horror. They were something more tangled, more human. Ruth Huddleston, one of the operators, said she was happy because her boyfriend was stationed in Germany and now he would come home. But it bothered her, she admitted years later, that she had played a part in killing so many people. She accepted it the way soldiers accept it, with the grim arithmetic of war. If the bomb had not been dropped, she said, more people would have been killed. Another operator, Gladys Owens, did not learn what she had actually been doing until decades after the war. She had spent years adjusting dials on a machine whose purpose she could not have imagined if she had tried. A manager at the plant had once told the women, "We can train you how to do what is needed, but we cannot tell you what you are doing. I can only tell you that if our enemies beat us to it, God have mercy on us." Those words hung in the air like a prayer that no one understood until the prayer was answered by a flash of light brighter than the sun over a city of 300,000 people who had never heard the word Calutron and never would. When the war ended, the Calutrons were shut down. By December 1946, gaseous diffusion had proven cheaper and more efficient for enriching uranium. The massive racetracks were dismantled, and the most extraordinary accounting operation in industrial history began. The silver had to be recovered. 940 coils, each weighing 14 tons, had to be unwound. The silver strips had to be extracted from their wooden insulation in steel housings. The metal had to be melted down, refined back to .999 fineness, and recast into bullion bars matching the original treasury specifications. The work was painstaking. It could not be rushed. Every shortcut risked losing silver, and losing silver risked a political catastrophe. The process took years, and then more years. Some Calutrons continued operating after the war, not for uranium, but for separating stable isotopes used in medical research and cancer treatment. The same silver-wound magnets that had separated atoms of death now separated atoms of healing. The machines that helped build a bomb that killed 100,000 people also helped produce isotopes that would save millions of lives in hospitals around the world. The last of the silver was not returned to the West Point Bullion Depository until June 1, 1970, 28 years after it had been borrowed. When the final accounting was done, less than 36 thousandths of 1% of the more than 14,700 tons was missing. In absolute terms, a few tons out of nearly 15,000. given that the silver had been melted, extruded, rolled into strips, wound into coils, installed in machines, subjected to years of intense electromagnetic stress, unwound, remelted, and recast into bars, the loss was almost miraculous. Groves's paranoia about accountability had proven to be genius. The Treasury got its money back, down to fractions of an ounce. Today, the Y-12 site still operates. It is the Y-12 National Security Complex, a Department of Energy facility that manufactures components for nuclear weapons. The original Calutron buildings are mostly gone. A few Beta-3 racetracks survive, the only remaining production equipment from the electromagnetic separation process. They are preserved not as monuments to war, but as monuments to physics. They were used after the war and into the 1970s to produce over 200 stable isotopes for cancer treatment, medical diagnostics, and scientific research. The Alice Chalmers plant on Holly Road in West Allis, Wisconsin, is gone. The site where 27 million pounds of silver were wound into magnet coils is now an office complex called Renaissance Place. Its tenants include insurance companies and healthcare firms. There is no plaque, there is no marker. There is nothing to indicate that more silver passed through those walls during the war than the entire United States Mint consumed for coinage in the same period. The West Point Bullion Depository still stands. The silver is back on its shelves, stacked in bars in climate-controlled vaults inside the walls of the military academy. Cadets walk past it every day. They do not know, most of them, that the metal beneath their feet once traveled across the country in secret trains, was melted and forged into instruments of physics, helped separate the element that ended a world war and began a nuclear age, and then was quietly returned, cleaned, recast, and put back on the shelf as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The silver remembered. Metal holds the memory of its working. Every bar that went through the furnaces at Carteret, the rolling mills at Bayway, the winding machines at Milwaukee, and the screaming magnetic fields at Oak Ridge carries in its crystal structure the invisible ghost of that journey. The silver that sits in the vault today is not the same silver that sat there in 1942. It is the same atoms, yes, the same weight within thousandths of a percent, but it has been through the fire. It has been hammered and drawn and wound into coils that bent the paths of individual atoms, atom by atom, sorting the light from the heavy, the volatile from the stable, the dangerous from the inert. It participated in the most consequential industrial project in human history. It helped build a weapon that ended one world and began another. And now it sits in the dark, in a vault, in silence. The bars are cold, the stamps are sharp, the ledgers are balanced, and the silver waits for no one to remember what it did, what it helped separate, what it helped create, what it helped destroy. The treasure of a nation, borrowed for a war, returned to the penny, carrying a secret in its grain that no audit will ever reveal. The butterfly that weighed 0.6 of a gram lifted its wings over Hiroshima, and the wind it created has never stopped blowing.